Hello everyone, welcome to Pragmatic Talks. Before starting, I would like to introduce you all with our speaker Paul Jackson. Paul is currently a partner at Pivot Ventures. They help early stage startups in building their products. He has a very exciting journey till now. So let's begin this evening with Paul, and I would like you to take over the session, Paul, from here.
As Piyush mentioned, it's a real honor to be here. The focus of the session today is on the concept of product value. There's a very high-level agenda that I'm going to run through. Keep it simple and focused. We're going to talk about what product value is, why it matters, and then how do you measure it. Before I kick off, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what I do and why product value is relevant to my profession. I'm a partner in a venture services firm in London called Pivot Venture Services. It's a new category in the venture capital space, and very simply, we build software platforms and products for very early stage companies, startups, in exchange for equity. We take the view that for early stage founders, particularly those that are not themselves engineers, the two biggest obstacles they face when they're starting their company is they have a need for product, software, and they have the need for capital to pay for that product, as well as additional services. And Pivot endeavors to solve both problems in one exchange. So as a partnership, there's two partners in the firm. There's myself. I lead on product. My background is in product management and software development. And my partner, Stephen, who heads up investment strategy. And effectively, we are making two judgments in order to determine whether or not to work with a startup. The first is a product judgment or product evaluation, which says, is this a product that we think is buildable, but also could potentially be a successful product? And then on the second side, we're looking at the market and the founder. Is this a market that is big enough to warrant an investment? Could this be a £100 million company? And is this founder somebody that we can see as a CEO of a £100 million company? And both evaluations are value judgments. And so as the product side of the business, it's critical to my success that I can make judgments about product value. So when we're meeting startup founders and understanding what their mission is, I'm looking for product value. So if we start by looking at what is product value, it's important to point out at the beginning that it's a fairly difficult concept to pin down, which is of course why not many people talk about it. And at the product management level, those product managers that are managing backlogs and shipping product value is not a term that typically drives a lot of the decisions because it by itself is quite hard to measure. One of the foremost thinkers on product value and the concept of value is this guy. His name's Eric Almquist. He's a partner at Bain & Company in the US. He spent 15 years trying to understand and researching the concept of value in mainly large enterprises in the United States. And he has come to the conclusion that value is psychological, amorphous, and complex. So by definition, it's very subjective and it's very different depending on who you speak to. So a difficult thing to pin down. We could take a very basic definition of what product value is. And if we start with a fairly obvious definition, product value is the benefit that a customer gets by using a product to satisfy her needs minus the costs. That was a traditional view of product value and how people understand value for probably 50 years, until maybe the late 80s, early 90s, when this guy came along, Daniel Kahneman, the father of behavioral economics, and a lot of our understanding around the psychology of purchasing and consumer behavior. He's best known for his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He developed a theory that really exploded this notion that the way we look at value is a very rational, logical deduction in our heads. Judgments that we make to be in terms of losses and gains. So the main thing to understand here is that value is relative. It's relative to your own situation, but it's also relative to the other options in the market. So the three elements of prospect theory that are fundamental to how we understand product value is that the outcomes of using a product are judged by the individual in terms of gains and losses, that gains and losses are relative to the individual and their context, and this famous statement that he made, which is losses loom larger than gains. This has become known as loss aversion, and basically means that we hate losing things more than we like gaining things. So as a product manager, it's fundamental to understand if somebody's going to move to your product, particularly if they're going to switch their behavior from another product to yours, understanding what they think they'll be losing versus what they'll be gaining. This notion of the pain from a loss outweighing the pleasure from a gain is really fundamental. It doesn't just affect product switching behavior, but it also affects updating your product, new releases, any change to your product that takes something away but adds something else. One of the biggest challenges you face is the pain from the loss going to outweigh the gain? This is known as the endowment effect, and is much more powerful than we realize. And as a product manager, I believe very strongly in a concept called total product value, which is that people perceive your product in its entirety as a total experience. They don't necessarily deconstruct it in the ways you as a product manager who's deep in the technology and deep in the engineering would do. And you as a product manager need to think about all the different elements, the features that you could introduce, the look and feel, the price of the product, the usability and the speed. And you're constantly making trade-offs around those combination of different elements. And ideally, if you're a really smart product manager, you're thinking about the total product value. Typically, a product has a few key features that deliver the vast majority of value. So value is typically in the user's mind actually weighted or skewed very much in a small section of your product. And the main thing is that it's possible to destroy product value whilst making changes. As you can see, it would be great if every time you added something to your product or made a change in your product, in your mind, you're increasing the value, you're improving it, you're making new features available, you're making design changes that are improvements. But the reality is that by doing this, you can actually not only diminish the value, but potentially destroy the value. And the best example of this, I would say, is Snapchat, that has made a number of redesign and number of releases around the design over the last 12 months or so. And every single one, in the perception of the public, has destroyed product value and reduced their user base. So for me, they are an ideal example of how to destroy total product value whilst trying to improve it, versus its obvious competitor, Instagram, who I think has been very, very focused on what that total product value is and been very careful to maintain it. The actual product itself has not changed dramatically after many, many years out in the market. And that's because they understand that by interfering with it, they would ultimately destroy product value. So why does product value matter? Well, as you can probably infer from what I'm saying, my view is that value sits behind everything. It sits behind every part of the decisions you make about your product, and ultimately its understanding and success in the market. It sits behind the price of the product, how much you think you can charge. It sits behind how you position a product and how you market it. It sits behind the features that you introduce into the product from your backlog, and it sits behind your decisions around which users to address and target. I'm sure you're all familiar with the school of thinking around product management and product development, which is called the jobs to be done school. This takes the notion that people have a notion of progress in their lives. People are naturally trying to create beneficial outcomes in their lives. They want to make their lives better. They want to make progress. And classic to this jobs to be done thinking is that they rent or hire your product in order to achieve those outcomes. Products themselves don't have jobs, people have jobs, and they use products and services in order to enable those outcomes. And the classic declaration of the jobs to be done school is that to really understand a product and communicate a product, you're not talking about what's on the left, which is the specifics, the engineers, the technicality of the product. What you're actually talking about is how the user's life is going to be better, the progress that they're going to make in their lives, how you're going to make them awesome, to use a very Americanized term. And of course, from a product management perspective, that is a value judgment. You're looking at the value that a user ascribes to the experience of your product. You're transcending the specifics of your product to look at the overall experience, the total product value. And you're also linking, and I think this is critical, value links product management, what you do with the product or what you make the product as, and product marketing, which is how you communicate the product. In a small startup, product marketing and product management don't exist in separate functions. They're not different people. Often they're the founder. And I really think that product marketing and product management need to sit together, ideally in one person and over time in one unit, because that access of value that links the two is really fundamental. You can't build a product without understanding or being connected to how you market the product. The classic example of this, again, is what made Steve Jobs so successful. He created the iPod, but he never talked about the engineering or the technology of the iPod. He famously said that it was 1,000 songs in your pocket. Again, linking the product management via the value axis directly into the product marketing. Many of you will also be familiar with this guy, Chamath Palihapitiya. He was one of the founding members of Facebook, the founding member of the growth team and the acquisition team at Facebook, grew Facebook from a small user base into hundreds of millions of users, and is now a venture capitalist at Social Capital in Silicon Valley. He made the statement that users are only ever in 3 states. He's very quotable, Chamath, about a number of things, very articulate and funny. Users are only ever in 3 states. They've never heard about your product, they've tried your product, and they use your product. As a product manager, he said, what you're managing is state change. And if you conceive of your product, I would actually add on the right a 4th pillar of user familiarity, this state change that Chamath talks about. On the left, you've got somebody who doesn't know anything about you. Next, you've got somebody who's heard about you and is trying to figure you out. And when I say you, I mean your product or your company. The 3rd from the left is somebody that gets your product, they're using it, they're understanding it. And then on the far right, you have the super users who want to customize the product around their own specific requirements. Now, that maps quite nicely into how engineering teams and software teams are being constituted in large tech organizations. On the left, you have the acquisition and growth team. They're the ones who are addressing the problem of how do you communicate what a product is. You now have this onboarding team who are absolutely focused on bringing new users into the product as quickly as possible. Onboarding has become a huge area of science, really, within product management and product development. And after that, you have core task completion, which is the fundamental functionality of the product. And then on the right, you've got those that actually want to administer and customize the product. Now, each one of those stages is a different value stage and requires a different transmission of value. In the first stage, you're promising value. It's all about the messaging. You're talking about what the value is to the user. Then onboarding, you're demonstrating value. You're actually showing the value for the first time as quickly as possible. The core usage is that you're delivering value consistently and frequently as the user moves through these different states. That maps nicely onto the different functions within a software organization. We've got the growth team, the onboarding team, the core products team, and then the administration team. This is where I got to, which is about each one is transmitting a different type of value. They're promising value, they're demonstrating value, they're delivering value, and you're extending value around customization. And again, this maps nicely onto how we understand the product. What's also important, and this was another big point, big observation of Chamath, who was really one of the pioneers of this, you've got this moment called the aha moment, which Facebook and Twitter have talked about a lot. They definitely buy into this being a real moment. The aha moment is this moment when people understand the value of the product and understand how it will benefit their lives. And Chamath was very, very, very clear that he thought that the growth of a product starts with a deep understanding of product value and is about moving new users to the aha moment as quickly as possible. And for Facebook, this was measurable in seconds because they were such a high-performing, high-volume product that every single part of a second that they could move that aha moment forward was worth hundreds of millions, if not billions, to them. So we come back to this guy, Eric Armquist, who I mentioned earlier. In terms of the different lenses and the different frameworks that we can use to really understand what product value means in real terms, again, I would say he's probably the foremost contributor to this thinking at this stage. He, as I said, looked a lot into organizations, and he came to this conclusion that most managers, most executives, most people in organizations were really experts on cost and really had no idea or spent very little time trying to understand demand. Demand is very difficult, it's hard, it's all about this notion of value. And so as a result, most organizational focus was on this left side of the axis, which was about reducing costs in the supply chain. And this, of course, then became a debate between an understanding of price versus an understanding of value. And Armquist concluded that most middle managers and most executives are experts on price, but really don't have any idea about value. And so him and his team worked very hard to develop a framework for understanding value. And they published in the last couple of years what I think is one of the best frameworks for understanding value. They took this recognizable trope of the Maslow pyramid, the pyramid of needs, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and overlaid 30 different elements of value that they had understood a product could deliver based on the research they did. This is the B2C version, which they published first, and you can see that there are different dimensions to it. Firstly, it's split in half. So on the left-hand side, you've got inwardly focused value elements, those that improve inwardly your own perception, your own experience of the value of life. And then on the outside, on the right side, you've got outward-facing value. It's also tiered, so you've got 4 layers. The base, it starts at the base layer, which is the functional elements of value. These are obvious things like saving time, avoiding hassle, reducing cost. And what Armquist and his team recommended, or were strong proponents of, is that for those that moved higher up the pyramid in terms of how they delivered value, it was not only more profitable, but it was less competitive. He said everybody instinctively tries to compete on the bottom layer, the functional elements of value. And he didn't say that this was a bad business to be in. Amazon, Uber, they all compete and have done very well by competing at the functional level. But he said if you look upwards on the emotional and life-changing elements, things like reducing anxiety, improving wellness, and even at the top, providing hope and even actualization to individuals, then i.e. making people feel like if they buy your product, they're making the world a better place. He said that's the absolute zenith of product value achievement. And so he recommended that everyone perform an analysis on their product and understand which value elements that they compete on. The main thing to remember in this is that it's not about being excellent at all 30 elements. He said that's impossible and ridiculously costly. And he said, if you look at the best companies in the world, and he identified Amazon and Apple as 2 good examples, they really are only better at between 8 and 11 different value elements. In the case of Amazon, 8, in the case of Apple, 11. So it's very much about understanding which elements you compete on and being excellent at them. Armquist has subsequently, for those in the B2B product space, he's subsequently published another pyramid for the B2B elements of value. Again, too much detail to really go into here, but it looks at things like the ease of doing business versus individual value within the organization. Have a look at Bain & Company website or Harvard Business Review, where he published the initial articles I think these are really useful frameworks to refer to understand value. Leading on fairly neatly into how you measure value. So again, it's not easy, but it all starts with user research, talking to your users or listening to your users, listening to the comments that come in through Zendesk and the various other channels. Like any product manager, I believe strongly that there is really you can't get more value than speaking to users and listening to what they're actually saying. And this could be when you're researching a new product that has not yet been built, which is the space I work in typically, or it can be listening to customers feeding back on your existing product. And of course, my recommendation is that you look for value statements, and people tend to talk in value statements. And it's words like, it would be awesome. It's an unbelievable waste of time. The way we work right now is a nightmare. Wouldn't it be amazing if? These are all value statements. And rather than simply listen to them, my recommendation is that you then try and deconstruct those with the user. Say, okay, what do you mean by awesome? How would it be awesome? And then ask them to go to that next level of detail, because then you'll start to understand the actual value elements they're talking about. If it would be awesome, how would it be awesome? Well, it'd be awesome because it would save them time, or it would save them a lot of repetitive work, which is a common concern in the workplace, or it would save them a large amount of money, or it would give them peace of mind. These are all really useful ways to start to dig in and understand the actual value elements, because when you get down to that level, time, dependencies, reduction of repetitive work, you can then start to actually quantify and measure these things. So the main thing is to start looking for value statements made by users and then start to dig into that a little bit more. The next thing, again, is to go back to Armquist pyramid and then start to look at, from the feedback and the research you're doing, which are the elements of value that it feels the product is competing on, or that users are telling you is giving benefit to their lives. This could be, reducing anxiety, reducing cost, or in the case of the B2B one, it's improving their expertise, it's improving their reputation, it's decreasing hassle, or it's a good cultural fit within the overall organization. And then ask the users to then prioritize these, rate them, put them in order. And then you can start to see exactly what is the hierarchy of value that users want from your products, because this then gives you what is commonly known as your due north. So it allows you to understand fundamentally what is the value people get from your product. That means you can then start to improve it and look at ways of allowing them to save even more time or reduce even more cost. But it also means that you won't then start compromising that element in future releases and future developments. It means that you understand that saving time is really the fundamental value contribution of the product, and that by no feature release and no change should ever compromise that, because then you end up in this situation that Snapchat found themselves. So as a final sign-off, I would just ask or recommend that the whole point of product value is to start to think above your product as just features, screens, or individual technologies, but that you should begin by identifying the value that the product will deliver or does deliver, and that ties into the outcomes that users are looking to achieve. And then from that, start to look at how to develop your product in the real world. So I think that covers it. Hopefully that was just about on time, Piyush. And if anyone has any questions, then I'd be happy to try and respond.
So ask us a question at early stage, how do you prioritize between increasing UI UX versus going for top line growth?
Sorry, top line what, Piyush?
Yes.
Between prioritizing UX and, sorry, what was the second part?
Between prioritizing, increasing UI UX versus going for top line growth.
Well, again, that's a different level of value that I didn't have time to get into, but obviously user experience is something that cuts across every single part of the product and is a broad thing. But I don't think the two are necessarily, I think the two are complementary. It very much depends on what at the time you think is the priority. So top line growth, I would say, is always something you're trying to achieve, but it's how you do that with the product without at the same time compromising the value. So how is jobs to be done connected to value? Well, my argument is that jobs to be done looks at the understanding the outcomes that users are looking for in their product. And outcomes and the ability to achieve them, I would argue, are value judgments. They are related to this Daniel Kahneman view that they're looking towards gains. If we look at everything about being about gains and losses in your life, I would argue that outcomes, which is what people are trying to achieve with products, are value judgments. And therefore, value is critical to how jobs to be done conceives of product.
I hope that answers Pavel. Then Ayush has a question. In the very early stage startups, the product value changes rapidly as the startup pivots. How would you look for a North Star in such case?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The short answer is that the value change. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely correct. Value changes with a pivot, but a pivot is a very major change in how the business is going to market, and therefore, I would say the North Star is a measure of what the pivot is about. So if we say we're going to pivot from trying to sell product to being a marketplace, which is a classic business pivot, then all of a sudden, the nature of the pivot is determining the new value statement. So the priority value within that pivot is how you measure the North Star. If we want to define what the North Star is, it is a measure of the number one or the primary value element of the product at any one time.
Then Prashant has a question. Is there a way to measure statements like reduces anxiety, makes me look good? What's the best way to estimate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Short answer is it's not easy. My recommendation is that it's really through questioning and answering, and it's understanding from the user what exactly anxiety means to them and how it affects them. The assumption is that anxiety is a bad thing and that it affects their life in a way, and that if they reduce their anxiety, their life would be better. So it's about asking, okay, so if you didn't have that anxiety, how would your life change? And then listening to those answers and trying to quantify it. Oftentimes, if you ask enough questions, you can usually get to something that is measurable. It's not necessarily obvious straight away. Obviously, things like peace of mind, the one that I mentioned, it's very similar. How do you measure peace of mind? Well, it can be number of hours lost in productivity. It can be as simple as additional hours sleep. Ultimately, things can be broken down to something that can be measured, and the route to it is asking more questions. It's understanding what anxiety means at a granular level.
Great. So Pavel has elaborated his question like how his product strategy is connected to value. I hope this question has been answered. Then Suhas has a question. Any resources that you would like to share with that will help us to build their skills?
Well, I certainly, as you could probably tell, recommend Eric Armquist's work with the pyramids of value. I think it's a useful exercise for any product manager to take one of the pyramids, either the B2C pyramid or the B2B pyramid, depending on the nature of their product, and debating with their team or their leadership team what are the elements of value they believe that they compete on, and then understanding how their backlog helps achieve those. It's not a time-consuming exercise. It's something that everybody in the company should have a view on, and I think it's a useful lens to try and clarify where we think we're adding value. Because the main thing is that, one, you might get different people's views, and that people will disagree over what is the value they're delivering. And secondly, it's impossible to compete on every value element. So the point is to understand the core value elements that you believe you're competing on, and then prioritize all of your efforts, the backlog, the marketing, the sales effort around those value elements. Armquist's view is that the most successful companies understand the value they're delivering. If you take Jeff Bezos, it's all about quicker delivery and cheaper cost or cheaper price. And he has absolutely obsessively focused the entire business around those two value elements in particular. Armquist would argue that it's that level of focus that achieves success in the marketplace.
And Zafar has a question. Does value decrease with more players in the market?
I'm just trying to think through. Value to the user does not decrease with more players in the market. In many ways, their ability to achieve value is increased because it becomes more competitive, and in theory, that then drives up the value. Increased competition in the market, I would say, means that those that understand the value they're delivering are more successful. Greater pressure on people to focus on the value elements in order to succeed. If you don't understand the value you're delivering, then you'll be worse than a commodity, and you'll really struggle, I think, to profit.
Now, how do you measure value of a product at its inflation point?
I wouldn't say there's an absolute value of a product. And by inflection point, do we mean the hockey stick moment when all of a sudden they start achieving hyper growth? That's how I understand what the inflection point is. I don't think there's a definitive value understanding of it or measurement of it. But I would say that is the moment when value is successfully communicated to a much wider base. One of the things we didn't talk about too much, but is very relevant, is that you've got first adopters, what's called the early minority, and then you've got later adopters, which is the late majority. And the inflection point in any product is when you successfully cross the chasm, as it said, from appealing to a small set of early users to a much broader market. And that's the inflection point in a company. And what they've achieved, what a company who does that achieves, is an ability to communicate the value of their product beyond a small group to a much wider group of people. And so I would argue that the inflection point is more a result of successful marketing of product value than necessarily delivery of product value.
Santosh want to interrupt, and he's saying, no, it could be at a dilemma where the product can take a leap or fall apart.
So the product can take a leap or fall apart. If I understand the question correctly, and apologize if I don't, I think there is always, in any stage, but certainly in the early stages of product development for a new product, a constant discussion internally around what are those value elements? What is the value to the user? And how are we prioritizing and increasing the delivery of that value? And I think at any point, that moment can suddenly become less clear, or growth can stall, and all of a sudden it's problematic for the team to understand how to move forward. That could be the moment when they hit the points where they're no longer just talking to the early minority, but trying to reach the late majority. But ultimately, I would say if you are able to deliver value to a small user group and then communicate it to a wider group, that is really the discussion internally that will solve all of those problems. If I've understood the question correctly.
Great. I hope your query is answered, Devasu. Then Sankalp has a question. As product value is related to solving customer problem, so how come such big companies such as Snapchat commit such blunders even after extensively doing customer research and alpha beta testing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, firstly, I don't know too much about Snapchat's internal process. And so I can only speculate. One possibility is that Snapchat didn't do much customer research. Similarly to Apple under Steve Jobs, they were very famous for saying that they didn't do much research, if any at all, and that really they just trusted their instinct. So one possibility with Snapchat is that Evan Spiegel trusted his instinct and redesigned the product and then put it out there, and there was this huge market reaction against it. That could be one reason why it happened, and once again, I can only speculate. We all know that user research can be misleading. There have been plenty of product failures, like New Coke many years ago when Coke tried to relaunch itself with a new flavor and it was a complete catastrophe and they had to wind it back. Windows 8, I think, when they tried to move to a much more Apple style interface, was also a disaster. So there's no absolutely right and wrong way, but what I would say is when this happens, it's because they lose sight of product value and what the core value is, and then deviate from it, or in some cases abandon it altogether. And so, I would say it is a breakdown of understanding or an overlooking of product value that leads these new release disasters to occur. And I mean, it's a fascinating subject. You really have to understand the inner workings of Snapchat to understand how that happened. But one possible reason is that the founding team didn't listen to their customers. They just did what they thought was right, and it had consequences.
Nice. Paywall has a question: is value and valuation of a company are the same thing? How do you calculate value of to make a VC decision?
Another great question. No, they're not. Valuation of a company is a very different calculation to do with the size of market and the potential of capturing that market. I would actually say that venture capitalists typically don't try and put a value on a product. This is more about the internal. This is more relevant to product managers. I think it is relevant to the executive team, but in my experience, this is not an analysis that venture capitalists typically undertake. Although I think they should, but typically venture capitalists are financiers. They're more interested in the underlying economics of a business. For them, product value would be too nebulous for them to get involved in.
Suhas has a question: do you want to share some resources that you generally follow around product strategy? Some books or some other resources?
Yeah, sure. Without question, certainly my favorite commentator on product strategy is the obvious one. It's Ben Thompson and his newsletter or publishing brand, which is called Stratechery, which is all about the strategy of big technology companies. It's a fantastic analysis of product strategy in 2018. This is something that I always read. I think I can share a number of different individual websites and blogs that I think are contributing a good value. First Round Capital or First Round Review generally publish very high quality product material. But in terms of books, too many to mention, but I'm happy to try and share one or two. The good news is that there's been an explosion of content in product over the last few years, so we're spoiled for choice. But as a rule, I would say there's still not too many people writing about product strategy, and so people like Ben Thompson at the moment are still one of the few people I think that are an authoritative voice.
Would you consider network effect as a product value? For example, Google Plus has access to a huge user base. and features were at par with Facebook but still could not take off?
Yeah, again, a great question. I read an interview with Mark Andreessen today, who is much better informed than I am. You know, the famous venture capitalist from Andreessen Horowitz, and he took the position in this interview that network effects are overrated. That whilst they can be valuable, they can also be either worthless, or they can actually, if your business is built on network effects and that network effect suddenly dries up, then your business can pretty much unravel overnight. And he cited an obvious example, which was MySpace. I wouldn't personally call the network effect a value element, simply because value elements to me are things that users benefit from. And whilst being a connected is certainly something that people value, I wouldn't say a network effect was how a user thinks of the value in their lives. So again, I can't be definitive about it, but I wouldn't personally classify it as a value element.
Great. Any more questions?
I'll just share actually that link to that interview, Piyush, because I thought it was a great interview with Mark Andreessen recently, where he covers some of this and a whole bunch more. And it was on the Andreessen Horowitz website. So let me just add that into the messaging.
Yes, yes.
There we go. That's a great piece, and it's also the one where he talks about the value of network effects. So thanks for the feedback, everybody. I apologize if the slides weren't keeping up. It's a real shame, because it probably meant that some of the understanding of what I was talking about was marginalized. I will obviously share the slides with Piyush, and he can hopefully share it with all of you. And if there's any more questions, do get in touch with me directly. My email is attached to this session, but also in the slides. So, I hope you find it useful. I think product value is definitely, it's not an issue that's ever, I think, going to not be important to product managers. It's never going to be something that technology will automate totally. It's always going to be something that product managers need to understand, because it's about the connection of individuals with technology, which I think is a great place to work, and is also the space that product managers work in. And so I think understanding product value and talking about product value is what I would call a perennial benefit. It's always something that I think will be very relevant.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for joining us today. The session was really helpful. And thank
no problem at all. Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And before ending, I would like to inform you that we have very few interesting sessions lined up for this month. You all can check by visiting our website. I am putting the link for the website in the chat section. You can check it out here. And thanks a lot.